Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
All right. Tonight our goal is to finish the second chapter of Revelation. We'll be discussing the Messianic community in Thiatera, which we actually went through the introduction of that community in Thiatera at the end of the session last week. And we gave so much information, it's kind of too extensive to redo here, so I'm going to just get right into breaking this down on a verse-by-verse basis. So let's find Revelation 2:18, please. It says, "To the angel of the Messianic community in Thiatera, write, here is the message from the Son of God, whose eyes are like fiery flame and whose feet are like burnished brass." Again, we have an introduction that describes Yeshua. This description is excerpted from part of the large description in the introduction to Revelation chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. And as in each of the letters that we've been looking at and will look at, this particular part of the description in Revelation 1, 14 and 15 has application to this specific Messianic congregation. It's interesting that this is the longest of the 7 letters to the Messianic congregations, and it is written to what would have been considered at the time of writing the least important of all of these congregations that these letters are written to. I also find it interesting that in the prophetic analysis that we did as part of the introduction last week, this prophecy is the pivotal point in the history of the body of Messiah. Points to a long period of time in the history of the body of Messiah. It points to a low point in the body of Messiah. It lasts up to the Reformation. All of these factors seem to fit together. Longest letter, this introduction as well as prophecy, least important to the Messianic communities, a low point in the body of Messiah, all the way to the Reformation. So let's see where this takes us. Thyatira was located about 40 miles south of Pergamon on the main Roman highway that ran through Asia, now modern Turkey. Thyatira was positioned for trading and probably was a significant trading center at the time of this writing. Thyatira was also well known throughout the world. Again, from trading point of view, it was well known as a city of merchants. The local gods of this city were dedicated to the city's economic well-being, which to me is interesting. It's interesting when someone has their own gods, how these gods seem to perform the functions that man thinks that he has needs for. So if the local gods were dedicated to the city's economic well-being, that would make the idolatry of Thyatira essentially materialism. The idolatry of Thyatira essentially was materialism. Their religious focus was most on their own wants and needs, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this aspect, but I do want us to look at one thing that Yeshua had to say in Matthew 6:19 through 21. This is talking about people who want to be very materialistic on the earth. Do not store up for yourselves wealth here on earth, where moths and rust destroy and burglars break in and steal. Instead, store up for yourselves wealth in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and burglars do not break in or steal. For where your wealth is, there your heart will also be. This focus on their own wants by the city of Thyatira really just seemed to consume the medieval church and pull it away from its focus on Adonai, because Thyatira is a prophetic of the medieval church that took place. We'll deal with that just a little bit more. Their focus on materialism in Thyatira was because I believe they had the largest number of craft guilds of any Asian city in that era. And I don't want to get bogged down in listing them, but archaeological evidence indicates if there was a craft there, it had a craft guild. Again, materialism was their focus. It is not therefore surprising that Thyatira is a setting in which we find Lydia, the dealer of purple. Anybody remember Lydia, the dealer in purple? I get some heads. Go to Acts chapter 16, please, verse 11. Sailing from Troas, this is Paul speaking, sailing from Troas, we made a straight run to Samothrace. The next day we went to Neapolis, and from there we went to Philippi, a Roman colony, and the leading city of that part of Macedonia. We spent a few days in this city. Then on Shabbat we went outside the gate to the riverside where we understood a minyan met. We sat down and began speaking to the women who had gathered themselves together there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thiatera named Lydia, a dealer in fine purple cloth. She was already a God-fearer, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to what Paul was saying. After she and the members of her household had been immersed, she gave us this invitation. If you consider me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my house. And she insisted until we went. Thyatira is the setting of this God-fearer, and this is where she would have come out from. Now, with this information on the city of Thyatira, it's also interesting. It is an interesting description that is given of the one who is writing the letter to the Messianic congregation located there. The message is from the Son of God, whose eyes are like fiery flame and whose feet are like burnished brass. If you remember from when we studied chapter 1, the only conclusion that can be reached is this is describing Adonai, the first and the last. And here, the bearer of this description from chapter 1 is now positively stating that he is the Son of God. These are the words of the Son of God. This further defines the description that we got of Yeshua in chapter 1, eyes like blazing fire. A lot of things behind that, but one of the thoughts is he sees everything. He sees all. There's nothing going on here that he isn't aware of. Nothing escapes him, whether man thinks he's getting away with it or not. Remember the horsemen that were gathered in the myrtle bushes of the valley in Zechariah chapter 1 when we studied that? Nothing escapes notice. Nothing escapes notice. The feet, like burnished bronze, can mean that he pursues all evil and treads it down. He's letting the Messianic community in Thyatira know what's going on between them and himself over the long haul. Again, nothing escapes his knowledge, and nothing of evil will be allowed to flourish long term. Revelation 2:19, please. I know what you are doing, your love, trust, service, and perseverance, and I know that you are doing more now than before. This again is giving a description to Thyatira. This is the commendation. Remember, all of the letters but one have a commendation of some sort, and this should be an example really to us. The Messiah is giving us a great example here. If you're going to have to bring correction, start off by emphasizing good points first. In other words, if you've got to bring correction, which he's going to do, start off by giving them their commendation first. Start off by emphasizing good points first, and then say, but which is what the next verse will start with that we'll read. Start off by emphasizing good points first and then say, but here is, this starts off like a letter to Ephesus. He tells them that he knows what they're doing. That's a significant statement in view of the salutation that we've just looked at. And when we consider it, these deeds that they're doing are the substance of faith or trust. Let's look into James chapter 2, please, verse 24. You see that a person is declared righteous because of actions and not because of faith alone. Likewise, wasn't Rahab the prostitute also declared righteous because of actions when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another route? Indeed, just as the body without a spirit is dead, so too faith without actions is dead. So this is a significant thing that Thiatera is being commended for, their actions, for what they're doing. Love and trust is mentioned first, immediately followed by service and perseverance. How do they actually carry out this love and trust? Through their actions, service and perseverance. First part would be devotion to God, then of course devotion to each other, carrying out the command of God. In Ephesus there was an accusation of abandoning their first love, slipping back from a previously held position. Thiatera, on the other hand, is commended for its progress. In effect, you are now doing more than you did at the start. Now, it appears from the following verses, the ones coming, that only a small segment of this congregation is being commended. Put that in your hat. From what we're going to look at coming up, it appears that only a small segment of this congregation was subject to these commendations that were being given. I think it will become apparent as we go through this because wickedness was actually enveloping this community and the whole community was being promised nothing but discipline. So here we have the commendation, but what follows the commendation, if we look at it, is Revelation 2:20, where he says, in spite of all this that I have for you, but I have this against you. You will continue to tolerate that Jezebel woman, the one who claims to be a prophet, but is teaching and deceiving my servants to commit sexual sin and eat food that has been sacrificed to idols. I will give her time to turn from her sin, but she doesn't want to repent of her immorality. This is really a very interesting couple of verses. It starts with language on the heels of commendation. Begins with, but I have this against you, which really serves to offset virtues just mentioned to a large degree, and the dangers mentioned are internal. They're internal, not external. With the previous communities, there were mentioned external things causing problems. Emperor worship was causing problems. Pagan deities were causing problems. Pressure imposed by the Roman state was causing problems. Even though the problem must also exist to some extent in Thyatira, the external isn't where the focus is here. It's on internal danger because there is now a woman called here who is a Jezebel woman. Who is a Jezebel woman? Most scholars believe that in identifying this person as a problem, the name Jezebel in itself is simply symbolic. This isn't speaking of the actual Jezebel. It's just to give us a reference to who Jezebel was in the Old Testament. Look at that for a minute. 1 Kings 16. It was in the 30th year of Asa, king of Judah, that Achab, the son of Omri, began his rule over Israel. Achab, the son of Omri, ruled 22 years over Israel in Shomron. That's the northern kingdom. Achab, the son of Omri, did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, outdoing all of his predecessors in wickedness. But then, as if it had been a trifling thing for him to commit sins of Yovarom, the son of Navat, he took as his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Et-Baal, king of Sidon, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. That's quite a curse there. No doubt that there was an actual woman involved in the Messianic congregation in Thiatera, but Jezebel is not the name of the woman. The Jezebel is simply used to describe a type of person. At that time, as now, the name Jezebel was associated with wickedness. You would not have a Jewish mother naming one of her daughters Jezebel in that particular era. Among the Gentile members of the community, the Messianic community, if someone had that name, it would hardly be good form to use it in the Messianic synagogue setting. The name is really symbolic, indicates the characteristics of the person named and what she is teaching. The original Jezebel was the daughter of the priest king at Baal. Baal meaning the false god. He was ruler of coastal Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon, Sidon is modern Sur in southern Lebanon. Ahab was the king of the northern kingdom, Israel, during part of the period of the divided kingdom. When Ahab married Jezebel, she persuaded him to allow her to replace the worship system in Israel with an entirely new worship system, establish a new priesthood. The new system was unlike the one that was in place. It brought in pagan worship practices to replace how the God of Israel was being worshipped prior to this. Now, admittedly, the worship practices in the northern kingdom had gotten pretty loose, but Jezebel moved them to a point really of no recognition, including the bringing in of idolatry to the Tyrian god Baal Makart, who was essentially the god of nature. The god of nature. Ahab built a sanctuary for Jezebel and her priesthood, a place to propagate the religion to this false god in Samaria, the capital. This then meant that the Israelites in time accepted a Baal as the god of Israel. Not everyone, obviously, because there is an event of Elijah and the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel. There's always a righteous remnant amongst Israel. So, Israel found itself in a position of accepting Baal as the god of Israel alongside Adonai, this reducing the God of Israel to being on a par with this nature deity. It's also interesting to note that this nature God is referred to by those that followed him as the King of Gods. Understanding that, then we understand what was really going on with Elijah and the event where he challenged the priests of Baal. There was a statement being made. Understand, they didn't abandon Adonai, they just took in another God. Just took in another God and elevated him, this other God, to a status equal to, or maybe just a little above, Adonai. This nature deity was the supreme manifestation of the elements of biological fertility, celebrated often in orgies of temple prostitution, which was part of that religion. So Jezebel's policies intensified the gradual contamination of the religion of Israel, the worship of Adonai, the true religion of Israel, and she did it by bringing in the Canaanite religion of Baal. And in this process, made easier by being spread over a period of time, this process sapped Israel of their faith in the one true God. It was an inside job. It was an inside job. This happened inside the confines of Israel. It was not assault by forces from without. Once we understand that, the nature of that kind of character was being displayed in this woman in Thiatera, the woman of Jezebel. She was doing exactly the same thing that the original Jezebel did, as she was making the destruction of the Messianic community an inside job. Then we can begin to grasp what's going on within this Messianic community in Thiatera. This name Jezebel here is not the woman's name, but is characterizing what is going on there. Same type of problem was being generated by this woman that was generated by Jezebel in Israel hundreds of years earlier. There's no doubt that this person was a member of the Messianic community in Thiatera, and within the jurisdiction of this community, they actually had authority over her. More than likely, then, she would have been the wife of an important member or leader, that she could continue with what she was doing, that she could wield such an influence on the congregation. Now, besides the descriptive title Jezebel, she's described as calling herself a prophetess. She's described as calling herself a prophetess. The claim she made was that she spoke for God. She claims that she spoke for God, and apparently large numbers of the congregation went along with this, were influenced by this claim. So she was not only propagating her own form of religion, she was saying that she spoke for God in doing this. The next thing that it mentions here is that she was doing this by her teaching. Doing this by her teaching, so she had a position in this community that allowed her to teach, thereby influencing others to her way of thinking. Her teachings had an intent and an effect. They were deceiving. Teaching and deceiving was her intent and effect, and this was successful in promoting sexual sin and eating the food that had been sacrificed to idols. Both pagan practices introduced along with the worship of Adonai. Now, to say that she was teaching these practices overtly undoubtedly pushes the envelope out maybe too far, I'm not sure. Although some of the newly won pagans might have accepted this as a norm of the worship of God and His Messiah. What it more represents is an introduction into this congregation of religious anarchy. Religious anarchy. A theological infidelity, if you will, out of which grows more overt facts. We would have to assume that the proliferation of the powerful trade guilds in Thiatera would have made it nearly impossible for a believer to earn a living there without belonging to one of these trade guilds. Membership in one of these trade guilds would have required attendance to guild banquets, and this meant eating meat that had been first sacrificed to idols, because there would always be sacrifices made to idols at these feasts. Do we understand that this is in fact symbolic of having a covenant meal with an idol or a demon that's behind that idol? The animal is killed. A portion of it is offered to the idol, usually burned up in flame. The rest is eaten by the people. It's the same critter being eaten by the idol and the people. In effect, a covenant meal shared with a false god. So what was a believer to do? They had to work, and if one didn't conform, they were potentially out of a job. Now, this more modern Jezebel must have reasoned that an idol, in her thinking, was really of no consequence, and advised believers to go ahead and eat such meals. And this begins to slide down a slippery slope because these meals too often degenerated into sexual looseness. The problem is, once the first step is taken into religious anarchy, the second becomes easier, as does the next and the one that follows that. The sacrificing to the idols was probably taking place right at these banquets. Keep the false gods lined up on their side for their continued prosperity. The religion in Thiatera was, after all, based on a prosperity doctrine. Theirs was a religion based on materialism. Then the wine would flow. Well, it was okay to do that. After all, it's just some idol. We really worship Adonai. Now, you know as well as I do that there would be those that would welcome a heresy of that kind. Still are today, judging by some people's lifestyles. It would enable them to maintain a biblical profession of faith while participating in things at pagans' level. This, in effect, became a doctrine of two spheres. A doctrine of two spheres, both of which they were participating in. And here we have a Jezebel type claiming to be a prophetess. So this gives this kind of teaching even more standing. She spoke for God. We can't minimize the importance of the question at issue nor the difficulty that some of the first century believers would have had in seeing the right course because of the pagan backgrounds that they'd come out of. we can't just say, look at them, boy, were they messed up. Because each generation, particularly ours today, must face the question, how far should I accept and adopt contemporary standards and practices? On the other hand, not deny the faith. These people were faced with the identical same thing with this Jezebel-type teacher, a prophetess within their community. Paul makes an interesting statement in 1 Corinthians 5:9 through 13. It says, in my earlier letter I wrote you not to associate with people who engage in sexual immorality. I didn't mean the sexually immoral people outside your community, or the greedy, or the thieves, or the idol worshippers, for then you would have to leave the world altogether. Next. No, what I wrote you was not to associate with anyone who is supposedly a brother, but who also engages in sexual immorality, is greedy, worships idol, is abusive, gets drunk, and steals. That's saying, for those of you who are loyal to me within the body of Messiah, you are not to associate with anyone in that body of Messiah who is also engaging in sexual immorality, greedy, worshiping idols, abusive, gets drunk, or steals. That's a pretty hard thing that gets pretty well ignored within our community today. We're not to give them a right of way. Do we see the problems being faced? They were living in that society that was going through all this stuff. They couldn't leave that society. So they had to associate with pagans in that society. But they didn't have to associate with the pagans within their own body. Today we have to associate with people that we come in contact with day to day. Back then, they cannot deny their faith. They cannot deny their membership in that society. The cause of Messiah is not served if his people appear to be trying to retreat from the real world, but they must not allow themselves to become part of the paganism of the world. The prophetess in Thiatera and her followers had been so ready to conform to the practices of their pagan neighbors that they lost sight of the essential biblical position. That is what is being talked about here. And that has been the teaching in this Messianic community, the adoption of contemporary standards and practices which are in conflict with the faith and a denial of the faith. And the message of this Jezebel was being received. That message was, maintain the biblical profession of faith while at the same time adopting and practicing immorality. That sums it up. Particularly immorality in a spiritual sense. For the sake of expediency, look again at Paul in Romans 12:2. In other words, do not let yourself be conformed to the standards of the Olam Hazah, the present world. Instead, keep letting yourself be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you will know what God wants and will agree that what He wants is good, satisfying, and able to succeed. See, this is the position that the bulk of the members of the congregation in Thiatera needed to return to. In Revelation 2:21, we were reminded of the mercies of God. This indicates that God had been dealing with this woman with patience. It appears right up to the point where she forecloses any further dealings with God. He has been dealing with her. The statement that she is unwilling to repent of her immorality is not a passive statement, but one of active choice. In her free will, she has made an active choice to oppose God. All right, moving ahead, Revelation 2:22. So I'm throwing her into a sick bed, and those who commit adultery with her I'm throwing into great trouble, unless they turn from the sins connected with what she does. And I will strike her children dead. Hang on to that. We're going to explore that some. Then all the Messianic communities will know that I am the one who searches minds and hearts, and that I will give to each of you what your deeds deserve. We're going to reap what we sow. Verse 22 actually gives us a little further insight into the teachings of this Jezebel. Some believe that Below the plain meaning of cast her into a bed of suffering is a hidden indication that she had also taught or promoted an escape from suffering. Do what you want to with that. Just toss that out there as a thought. But know that kind of teaching, an escape from suffering, is closely connected with materialism and a prosperity doctrine. We see that today in the distortion created through the prosperity doctrine teaching carried over. God isn't going to allow his people to suffer. Well, this is looking for material blessings. Yeshua said, in this life you will have sorrows. It's a spiritual blessing to be pursued, not a material blessing. Now, we see in these verses that there are two facts from Messiah. First fact also extends to the ones who have conformed to her teaching. Both spiritual and physical adultery are probably meant here, and unless they turn from their ways, shows that the situation is not incurable. See, it's talking about both spiritual and physical adultery here, but they can turn from their ways, so the situation is not incurable. If they haven't gone to the point where it is incurable, then God's compassion towards the sinner is generally very great. Second fact here is, I'll strike her children dead. It's generally believed that this doesn't refer to actual children in the community. This doesn't refer to actual children in the community, but to those who have been trained by the Jezebel to follow her patterns, who are carefully but fully committed to her teachings. You see, they were her children by training and commitment. It is interesting to note that their punishment is more harsh than that of the teacher, at least from a human perspective. Also, the words striking dead implied in there is with pestilence. The latter part of verse 23 indicates that Adonai does not have personal vengeance in mind. The object is, from that result of his actions, all of the Messianic communities will know that it is without Adonai who searches the minds and the hearts. Number 2, that he will give each of you, according to your deeds, you're going to get what you have earned. So the purpose and the execution of this threat is, if there is no turning from the sin, it is so that other Messianic communities will. Nothing is hidden from Messiah. This implies the adulterous acts that look religiously correct on the outside, but innerly corrupt people into spiritual idolatry. We have the same problem today. We have things that are going on, but not hidden from Messiah, implying adulterous acts that look religiously correct from the outside. But innerly corrupt people are taking them into spiritual adultery. And we have the same problem today. We have the same problem today. Many congregations do not discipline their members. It's just as simple as that. And they allowed them to sin within the midst of the congregation. Here we learn again that Adonai will not allow sin to go unpunished. I'll really give each of you what your deeds deserve, is what Adonai is saying. And you here is singular, which means it's a very personal thing. Each one, everyone will receive recompense in proportion to his deeds or her deeds, our deeds. This is not just talking about the community. This is talking about each person in the community. Moving ahead, Revelation 2:24. But the rest of you in Thiatera, to those who do not hold this teaching, who have not learned what some people call the deep things of the adversary, I say this: I am not loading you up with another burden. Only hold fast to what you have until I come. Only hold fast to what you have until I come. Remember, this is not talking in general to, at this moment, those that are following the Jezebel of that era. This is talking now to the people who are following the actual Messiah as he is represented. Now, First part of verse 24 tells us that this is now being addressed to those in the Messianic community that have not become part of the congregation of Jezebel, what I just mentioned. That phrase, the rest of you in Thiatera, opens two possibilities. One, that there were more than one Messianic congregation in Thiatera, or, number two, the one Messianic congregation was deeply divided by Jezebel's teachings. This woman that was acting as the Jezebel. I think I favor the latter. Two groups within a single congregation, one clinging to the truth planted with them, the other choosing to follow this Jezebel's teachings. The next statement is directed to those who have chosen not to follow the Jezebel teachings, those who have not learned the deep things of Satan. We need to take a minute to look really at what the deep things of Satan are all about. Because we're talking about the hidden things of Satan. That concept brings up two things that I think we have to consider. Number one, some had a commitment to or a holding to false teaching. And number two, a concerted effort was made to integrate these false teachings into the belief system. So what we're seeing going on today in many cases is not something new. It's been going on since 2,000 years. But there remained those who had refused to learn them. These now being addressed had not learned the deep things of the adversary. They had refused them, actually. They had refused to follow this Jezebel. Again, I want to compare the actions of the ancient Jezebel of the kingdom of Israel and this woman here. Some accepted the deep things of the adversary, some didn't. There's always a faithful remnant. Always in Israel there's a faithful remnant. Prophetic, this is the church of the Dark Ages. Now, remember, each of these 7 congregations is prophetic of a specific time in the history of the body of Messiah. This one separated the church of the Dark Ages, a new belief. Prophetically, it was part of the church of the Dark Ages, a new belief system, a separated priesthood, the integrating of contemporary standards and practices of the pagans that they encountered were brought into the church of the Dark Ages. It was a period from about the year 600 to 1517. 1517, long period of time, lasting from the marriage of the church and the state until the Reformation began. It is possible that this prophetess made the claims that they knew about these deep things of the adversary. That's what false prophets do. It's also interesting that the scripture here gives them no value by referring to them as the so-called deep things of the adversary. Note that. Don't call them deep secrets. It calls them the so-called deep secrets. In this day and age, we should be able to relate to this. It's common for cults today, in my lifetime, to have their own divine revelation. That being, they would say, here's what God really wants. And they would follow that. And they would say, I'm his appointed leader to say that these things happen. The head of the cult. See, Scripture tells us that nothing is to be added to the Scriptures. Plainly spelled out for us. It's possible in this community that it could have been taught in order to triumph over the adversary. It is necessary to know, perhaps even experience, the adversary's works. See, how are you going to overcome the adversary if you're actually going out and making him part of your activities and experiencing his actual works? It might have been promoted to know about the adversary back in those days. Today, we're in the same sort of a position in that there are many books published about the inner workings of Satan, and they're published under the guise of being biblical help aids, all being progressive doctrine to triumph over Satan is what we're taught. Again, let me say, nothing is to be added to the Scriptures. This last part of this letter is being written to those who have not learned what some people call the so-called deep things of the adversary. This is being taught to the people who have stayed true to God. The promise in this verse is not to impose another burden on you. The existing burdens are not specifically identified, just that there will be no more burdens placed on you that are remaining faithful. The service that those believers that hold to the true doctrine is a sufficient burden from them in this situation. Don't take the idea that this preaches status quo mentality. It doesn't. Not in the spiritual world. For a believer will find it difficult, if not impossible, to stay spiritually in the same place. We can't just pull up and stop spiritually and not grow anymore. Because if we do, things begin to change in spite of us. Sometimes just trying to stay in the same place will cause us to grow spiritually, because we'll be stopped and we'll see all these things going on around us. It states here, hold fast till I come. These words are encouragement in two ways. One, it shows we have the ability to hold fast because Yeshua said we could. The people in Thiatera had the ability to hold fast, otherwise Yeshua wouldn't have commanded it. We are never ordered to do something that is impossible for us. We are never ordered by the Lord to do something impossible for us to do. Number two here, the other thing is that He, Yeshua, is coming back. Not only for them that remained loyal to Him back then, but for those that remain loyal to Him in our current age and will be loyal to Him even up to the moment that He appears in the sky, even though they might not have gone on from this earth. So we know how this will all end. Revelation 2:26, please. To Him who wins the victory and does what I want until the goal is reached, I will give him authority over the nations. He will rule them with an iron staff and dash them to pieces like pottery. Wow. To those who prevail, those that hold fast, those that win victory, and do the will of Adonai to the end, authority is added to them. This is not just those who win the victory, who hold fast, but do this until the goal is reached. Until the goal is reached. So here there are two conditions for the following to occur. One is to hold fast, to be the victor, and two, do it until the goal is reached, indicating in most cases up in history until right now, indicating that this was held on to during a complete human lifespan. Now, at the end of the age, for a chosen few, there will be those taken directly. Winning the victory is doing the will of God to the end. To those who do this, authority over the nations is given. Many believe this is in reference to the millennium period. Such authority will be given at Messiah's return. And I'm not going to teach premillennialism, postmillennialism, or amillennialism again. We can refer back to that. The authority given to these specific believers is to rule. That's the authority. Those that are gone ahead come back with him. Some that are here will be transformed. So that's an interesting word here, to rule. Rule denotes both to shepherd and to devastate. Rule denotes both to shepherd and to devastate. The staff of iron here indicates absolute power and authority. The same power is delegated to these believers here as is given to Messiah in Psalm 2, 8, and 9. Could you give me that, please? Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance. The whole wide world will be your possession. You will break them with an iron rod, shatter them like a clay pot. A clear chain of delegation of power through Messiah to the believers who assist him in winning the victory, and a part in ruling with him to those who assist him in winning the victory. Revelation 2:28, just as I have received authority from my Father, I will also give him, that's speaking of the true believer, I will also give him the morning star. Those who have ears, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the Messianic communities. The meaning of verse 28 is difficult. There's a lot of meanings that have been attached to it, and I'm going to give you a few of those. When believers win through the strife, then Messiah will be theirs. And he, Messiah, is the morning star in this case. The presence of Adonai is meant here. The believer's ultimate reward is being with Adonai. That would be being with the morning star. The expression morning star refers to the privilege of ruling or sovereignty. In Revelation chapter 22, verse 16, it also refers to Yeshua as being the morning star. It's interesting what is said also in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 14. How did you come to fall from the heavens, morning star, son of the dawn? How did you come to be cut to the ground, conqueror of the nations? You thought to yourself, I will scale the heavens, I will raise my throne above God's stars, I will sit on the mount of assembly far away in the north. I will rise past the top of the clouds, I will make myself like the Most High. Some people believe this has a double meaning, and it's really addressed to Satan, talking to Satan as the primary angel in God's kingdom. Why did you do what you did? Well, this actually, if we look at verse 4 at the beginning of this passage in Isaiah 14, it actually states that this verse 4 is about the Babylonian king. Babylonian king that came into and conquered Israel. Now, what it's indicating is that he could have been something else had he chosen Adonai as his God. He didn't, but chose to imitate Hasatan, imitate Satan in what he did in coming into the land and coming against Israel. Satan could have been the archangel of all archangels, but he chose to take on what he took on. And this ruler of Babylon's option was he could have been under Adonai God, but he chose to take on what he took on, much in the ways that Satan did. And these passages using the morning star symbolize the concept. They symbolize the concept of sovereign rule, sovereignty, and they point to Messiah. I will give to him, the him that wins the victory. I will give to him the morning star. That is Messiah, Yeshua, salvation. So it could be said here that the one who wins the victory will be in the end times, will participate in the triumph of God's rule over all secular and ungodly forces. He will be given the morning star. He will be like the morning star. Probably the best translation, best I've got anyhow. Finally, are those that hold that this would be meant to mean glory for those of us that qualify. As Messiah will give us some of the glory that he has carried on himself. And that's some of the thoughts about the morning star. Morning star could be taught on for 3 weeks. It is really large. I might get into something in a few minutes about that. Finally, again in the last verse, we have this repetitive call to the attention of the continuous activity of the Holy Spirit. Keep paying attention to what you're hearing, to the activity of the Holy Spirit. Those who have ears, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the Messianic communities. Next week we'll go into chapter 3 and take up the Messianic community in Sardis. So we'll close with this for the moment.